essentially the two main points that I want to make in my talk today, not just the existence of other Jewish linguistic repertoires, the number of them, but also the fact that repertoires are a more appropriate way, I think, of dealing with the kind of issue raised at this conference. The next slide, please. There are many identifiable Jewish varieties. This map that Sarah Ben-Noah prepared includes a good number of them, and some exist still and continue to go on. Next slide, please. But the question is, what do we mean by a Jewish language or a Jewish variety? Next slide. Essentially, there's a field called Perceptual dialectology, which deals with the ability to recognize other varieties. I think of when I first went to Australia from New Zealand, my cousin took me out one night and I met some girls. And when I went home, I said, "That's very interesting." We were in Melbourne. I said, "That's very interesting, but where do they come from? They have a strange accent." And he said, "Oh, they come from Sydney," which is the neighboring town. I think of the problem my one of my research assistants, when we were doing our study of Jerusalem, we had working for us a undergraduate student from a Palestinian from the Triangle area, and he complained that when he went around Jerusalem, admittedly dressed like a student, his accent was assumed to be strange, and they thought probably he was an Iraqi Jew rather than an Arab from about 60 miles north. So that the recognition of differences is a critical problem in understanding the nature of Jewish repertoires. Next slide, please. Interesting question is how do people decide the name of the varieties? The speakers, of course, decide for themselves. There was a study recently in the United States of Jewish varieties that discovered virtually no speakers of Ladino. That was because, obviously, the speakers of Ladino reported that their language was Spanish. People talk about Deutsch or Deutsch rather than Yiddish. And the speakers' names for languages are often a version of the word Jewish. That's the speakers themselves. The interlocutors, the non-speakers of the variety, often talk about it as a jargon or a dialect. Linguists have their own fancy names. One thinks of Ladino, where one of my colleagues remarked, there are more names for the language probably than speakers. Not quite fair. Governments give names to languages in the constitutions. And there is something called the International Standards Organization, which has the responsibility for naming languages, the ISO 639 codes. Next slide, please. But it's not clear quite how you decide what is a language. One thinks of Yugoslavia, which during the period that Tito was the ruler, spoke Serbo-Croatian. And since independence, now has half a dozen or more separate languages reported. So Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegro, and so on. Slovak. Next slide, please. So I prefer to talk rather about languages, which are actually a political decision, to talk about repertoires, linguistic or communicative repertoires, which are, as John Gumpertz defined it a number of years ago, the totality of linguistic resources, including both invariant forms and variables available to members of particular communities. For example, those Hebrew words I used in my English are part of my linguistic repertoire. Next slide, please. Repertoires develop over time. Children at home start learning normally one variety, or sometimes two, if they're fortunate enough to be bilingual. They go to school where they have a language of instruction added or an official language added. They get jobs where their bosses want them to use certain languages. Their workmates choose other varieties, and so on. So that essentially an individual develops a quite complex repertoire of varieties in the course of their life. Next slide, please. Migration, of course, has a major effect. Before migration, whatever repertoire exists is changed when one moves to a new location. That in that new location, often another variety or two is added, and often there is modification of the repertoire, sort of hybridization, a mixture of the varieties, and the emergence of a new mixed variety, which of course is what we're talking about with most identified Jewish varieties. Next slide, please. Next slide. Assuming that the original Jews in Canaan spoke Hebrew, once the first exile to Babylon came, they added to that added Aramaic during the exile and returned to Judea, where there was a new mixed variety, probably Hebrew Aramaic, which continued to get more complex as time went by. Next slide, please. With the addition, first of all, of Greek from the Greek settlements. There were Jews in these Greek towns who spoke Greek, but probably also still kept up Hebrew, Aramaic, so that before the diaspora, there was already a complex repertoire of languages. Next slide. Which means that the question that many Christian scholars asked as to what language did Jesus speak was not particularly true, because in fact, at that period, there was already triglossia, at least three varieties, Hebrew written and spoken in the south, Aramaic widely spoken, and Greek around, and a little bit of Latin with the Roman army when they came in. Next slide. When Jews went into exile, the situation didn't change a great deal. Next slide. And wherever they went in the diaspora, to start with, they were probably speaking Greek, but as time went on, other languages were added to the Jewish repertoire. Next slide. With expulsion, for example, and migration, then Jews moving around, particularly the Mediterranean, European areas, picked up other languages, and they developed the beginning of the pattern of complex pattern of Jewish linguistic repertoires. Next slide, please. The Spanish Jews, for example, who were expelled in 1492, some went to Portugal, but then others moved east, and in the area of Yugoslavia, Greece, picked up new varieties and developed essentially a variety known nowadays as Ladino, or that's linguists prefer to call it Judesmo. Speakers of the language probably don't particularly notice what it should be called. And that produced one major Jewish variety in which there was a great deal of publication. Next slide. So that what was happening was starting with Hebrew, which remained the language of religion and the language of literacy in most Jewish communities, to which was added the earlier repertoires, new local repertoires developed, and the complexity continued on. Next slide, please. Which, of course, brings one to the interesting questions about Yiddish, such as where was Yiddish born? I rather like Professor Bider's talk yesterday when he made clear it continued to be reinvented, as it were, at different areas. There's no single beginning for Yiddish. Next slide. Its components, on the basis of the work of Weinreich and others, appear to be an original Jewish variety, a kind of Old French mixed with a High German, Middle High German dialect, later on adding a Slavic variety and producing the two major varieties, Western and Eastern Yiddish. Next slide, please. The Yiddish dialects were divided, very interestingly, between an East and a Western variety, and there was fascinating work that I remember reading many years ago showing that diet went along with dialect, whether you added salt or sugar to your gefilte fish, for example. Next slide, please. What happened to Yiddish after the destruction of most of the speakers was essentially the development of two particular varieties which kept up. A Hasidic variety spoken by Hasidim and some sects of Hasidim, and a kind of Yivo variety maintained by Yiddishists who felt it's as a heritage language. Next slide, please. But with education of Jews in the diaspora, slowly this use of Yiddish was replaced by the use of the local dominant language, whether in England or in the United States. Next slide, please. There has developed recently what Sarah Venor calls a Jewish English, which goes along with the return to fundamental observance of younger, late adolescence, where Yiddish and Hebrew words are brought into the English, and the same thing appears to happen with French and presumably Spanish, South American Jewish Spanish. Next slide, please. Now, apart from Yiddish, one of the major varieties, as I mentioned, is a kind of Judeo-Spanish, which developed in two major parts. The North African variety, called Hakatia, found mainly in Morocco, has Arabic influence, had to deal with the challenge of French, as French education was introduced by Jewish organizations in North Africa. The move to Israel produced Hebrew as a challenge, and the variety is disappearing. The second, the Eastern variety, which developed in the Balkans and Turkey, in the 19th century, again, there was a high level of literacy, but again, French was a challenge, and later on, Turkish in Turkey replaced the language, and those speakers of Judaismo or Ladino who came to Israel slowly have moved to Hebrew, the dominant language of the new state. And that essentially is the fate of most Jewish varieties on the return to Israel. Next slide, please. For example, Judeo-Arabic, which was a variety that became particularly strong in the whole of North Africa and Arab-speaking areas, including translations in the Middle Ages and religious works of major kinds. Until the 1940s, those Jews living in those areas moved either to America, where they switched to English, or to Israel, where their Judeo-Arabic has generally been replaced by a variety of Israeli Hebrew. Next slide, please. There are a small group of Berber Jews, but Berber was generally a second language to the speakers of Judeo-Arabic, and there's just a few customs kept and a few old people in Israel who still use sing-songs or whatever in the language. Next slide, please. In Italy, the varieties of Jewish languages varied in exactly the same way as Italian dialects varied, so that you have Judeo-Venetian, you have Judeo-Roman, you don't have a Judeo-Italian established as such. Next slide, please. In various areas in the east further, they've developed a variety called Juhuri. In Georgia, there was also a mixed repertoire. Next slide, please. In India, both a Cochin variety of a Jewish variety developed, and a Marathi variety, and some of these people, having moved to Israel, keep up some of their customs, but very little of their language. Next slide, please. So essentially what we're talking about are the changes in repertoires in the changing conditions. Next slide. And this is sort of the pattern. The isolation itself produced the variety. The difference in religion, obviously, the Jews living among Christians or the Jews living among Muslims, kept separate. There was often an internal ban on marriage. Intermarriage was banned both by the Jewish community and also by the outside community. There were food restrictions. Jewish diet was restricted to kashrut, and Christians had bans on eating with Jews. The living pattern was often closed. For example, in the East, there was the Pale of Settlement, the only area where Jews were allowed to live in Tsarist Russia. There were separate education systems, and there were even distinct clothing, sometimes by choice and sometimes by force, and walls around the places where the Jews lived, either built by the Jews themselves for protection or built by the non-Jews around them to keep them separate. This separation, of course, led to the variety in the repertoires. Next slide, please. Emancipation and education led to the shift to the local dominant language, the granting of civil rights, which starts more or less with Napoleon, the breakdown in residential limits, the opening of public schools and state schools to which Jews could go, the loss of employment restrictions, the programs to teach the standard language. All of this led to changes in the repertoire. Next slide, please. And that, of course, had linguistic consequences. A kind of three-generation pattern generally emerged. Immigrants themselves maintained their heritage language in the home and with their friends, but learnt the standard variety. Their children tend to be bilingual, which was a great advantage. Their grandchildren, though, are more likely to be monolingual in the standard dominant language. And occasionally, when it remains emotionally attractive, there is a post-vernacular heritage use of the language, as turns out, we'll say, with Ladino, where there are a lot of activity, post-vernacular activities. Next slide, please. What's going to happen to these Jewish repertoires? First of all, they will be maintained as the language of the old for a while. One thinks of fading Yiddish with low proficiency in the new standard variety. I remember many years ago going to a synagogue with Joshua Fishman and people coming up to him asking him for the correct Yiddish word for ceiling, something they had forgotten. Their English wasn't yet developed very fully, but their Yiddish was developed. In some cases, and particularly among the Hasidic groups that wish to keep separate, not just from Gentiles, but also from other Jews, there is an active community language. There is also the development of new religious varieties, yeshivish, as it's called, varieties of English, French, and Spanish, or the maintenance of a post-vernacular heritage language with clubs and classes and websites for Yiddish and Ladino and some of the Judeo-Aramaic language. All of this then produces a complex and dynamic and changing repertoire in which pieces of various named languages mix, producing the kind of puzzle that this conference has been meant to try and simplify. Next slide. Thank you very much.